I abandoned my son with Down syndrome. 35 years later, he forgave me. I was 18 years old, scared, alone, and when the doctors told me my newborn son had Down syndrome, I made a choice that would haunt me for the next 35 years. I left him at the hospital that cold November morning in 1989, thinking I was doing the right thing, thinking someone else could give him a better life than I ever could. But what I didn't know was that my son was growing up asking about me every single day, wondering why his mother never came back. This is the story of how I finally found the courage to face what I'd done, and how my beautiful boy taught me that forgiveness exists even for the most unforgivable mistakes. Before I can explain how all this happened, it's very important that you like and subscribe to the channel. That will help us a lot. Only then can we continue. Our future is in your hands. Now let's get back to this incredible story. My name is Margaret Elena Rodriguez, and I'm 72 years old now. I've spent more than half my life running from the truth, hiding behind excuses, pretending that what I did never really happened. But it did happen, and I can't run anymore. I can't hide anymore. The weight of those 35 years is finally too heavy to carry alone. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, in a strict Catholic family, where shame was currency and silence was survival. My father was a railroad worker. My mother stayed home and prayed the rosary every morning. We didn't have much money, but we had rules, and those rules were absolute. When I got pregnant at 18, the world as I knew it ended. There was no discussion about my dreams, about college, about the life I'd imagined for myself. There was only the pregnancy, the shame, the desperate need to make it disappear. The father was a boy named David, a mechanic who worked on the railroads with my dad. When I told him I was pregnant, he offered to marry me. Part of me wanted to say yes, to make it simple, to make it acceptable, in the eyes of my family and God. But another part of me, a younger part, wanted to run. I was so afraid, so utterly terrified of becoming my mother, of spending my life in a small house with a man I barely knew, raising children one after another until I forgot who I was. So when my son was born on November 14th, 1989, and the doctors told me he had Down syndrome, something inside me broke. I was already drowning in fear, already suffocating under the weight of motherhood, and now they were telling me my child would need extra help, extra attention, extra everything. In my young, selfish, frightened mind, I convinced myself that I was being noble by leaving him. I told myself he would have a better chance with a family who was prepared for this, who had resources I didn't have, who could give him opportunities I couldn't. I signed the papers at the hospital and walked out into the November morning without looking back. I told myself I was doing him a favor. I told myself I would forget. I told myself that someday this would all make sense. But none of those things were true, and for 35 years, I lived as a woman divided, carrying a secret that poisoned everything good in my life. I remember the exact moment I knew I was pregnant. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1989, and I was working at the San Antonio Public Library as a file clerk. My supervisor had asked me to reorganize the card catalog in the back room, and I was standing on a stepladder, reaching for the top shelf, when the nausea hit me like a wave. I barely made it to the bathroom before I got sick. When I came back out, my hands were shaking so badly that I had to ask to go home early. I bought the pregnancy test at a CVS pharmacy across the street from the library. I was too embarrassed to go to the one near my house, too afraid that someone from the neighborhood would see me. The test confirmed what my body had already been screaming at me for 2 weeks. 2 pink lines. A life. My life. Over before it had even started. David found out 3 weeks later. I remember sitting in his truck outside the Sonic drive-in, not eating, just pushing my milkshake around with a straw, while he processed what I was telling him. He was a good man, really. Hard-working, kind in his own way. But he was also 21 years old, and had dreams of saving enough money to buy his own garage someday. When I told him about the baby, I watched his dreams die right in front of me. He wanted to do the right thing. He proposed to me that same night, pulling out a small diamond ring that he'd apparently been planning to give me for months. Part of me wanted to say yes. Part of me wanted to take the easy way out, to let someone else make the decisions, to let David be the strong one, and carry me through this. But I was terrified. I was 18 years old, and I could see my entire future mapped out in front of me, and it looked exactly like my mother's life. A small house, a husband I barely knew. Children one after another, year after year, until there was nothing left of me but exhaustion and regret. So I said no. I told David that I couldn't marry him, that I wasn't ready to be a wife, that having a baby with him would be a mistake for both of us. He cried. I'd never seen a man cry before, and it broke something in me that I've never been able to fully repair. But I didn't change my mind. My parents found out about the pregnancy in June, 3 months after I'd already missed my first period. I'd been hiding it, wearing loose clothes, avoiding my mother, praying every night that somehow it would go away on its own. But one afternoon my mother came into my room, without knocking, and found me sitting on my bed, holding my swollen stomach. I'll never forget the look on her face. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was disappointment, which somehow felt worse. My father didn't speak to me for a week after that. He would come home from work, eat dinner in silence, and go to bed without acknowledging my existence. My mother, on the other hand, became a flurry of activity. She called the church and spoke to Father Miguel about options. She researched adoption agencies. She made phone calls to distant relatives to see if anyone could help. She was trying to fix me, to erase the mistake I'd made, to restore the family honor that I'd destroyed by being stupid and reckless and young. By August, my pregnancy was undeniable. I was huge, swollen, uncomfortable in every way. My mother had insisted that I quit my job at the library, which meant I spent my days at home, feeling like a prisoner in my own house. My father still barely spoke to me. My younger brother, Carlos, who was only 13, seemed ashamed of me. And David, heartbroken David, had started dating someone else, a girl named Angela, who worked at his father's auto shop. The due date was November 14th. As the months crept forward, I became increasingly convinced that I couldn't do this. I couldn't be a mother. I couldn't raise a child alone. I couldn't handle the judgment, the shame, the weight of a tiny human depending on me for everything. My mother kept saying that once the baby was born, I would feel differently, that motherhood would transform me, that love would make everything okay. But I didn't believe her. I looked at her tired face, her worn-out hands, her life that had shrunk down to nothing but obligations and duties, and I thought, no, that will not be me. In October, my mother took me to see a priest at a church across town. Not our regular church where people knew us. This priest had connections, she said. This priest could help us find a good family, a Catholic family, people who were prepared for this kind of responsibility. We sat in his office, and he talked to me about adoption, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like millions of girls did it every day, like I would simply give birth and then move on with my life, as if nothing had happened. He asked me if I was sure. He asked me if I understood what I was doing. He asked me if I was doing this for myself or for the baby, and I lied. I told him I was doing it for the baby, that I was being selfless, that I wanted to give my child a better life. But the truth, the thing I could barely admit to myself, was that I was doing it for me. I was saving myself. I was choosing my freedom over my son's mother. November came and I was ready to be done with this, ready to take back my life, ready to forget that any of this had ever happened. I went into labor on a cold, rainy Tuesday evening. My mother drove me to the hospital, and I remember her holding my hand during the contractions, whispering prayers under her breath, telling me that it would all be over soon. She didn't know that I meant those words literally. It would be over. All of it. Done. My son was born at 3:47 in the morning on November 14th, 1989. He weighed 6 pounds, 3 ounces, and he had his father's dark eyes and a full head of thick black hair. When the nurse placed him in my arms for the first time, I felt something I wasn't expecting. It wasn't love exactly. It was recognition. This tiny person was part of me. He had come from me. And in that moment, I understood that I would carry him with me for the rest of my life, whether I raised him or not. But the moment passed. The doctor came in, and his expression changed. He said he needed to run some tests, that they'd noticed some concerning features, some physical characteristics that suggested possible genetic abnormalities. My heart stopped. Genetic abnormalities. That was the language they used to describe my son, like he was some kind of experiment gone wrong, some broken thing that needed to be fixed. Have you ever noticed how a single moment can change the entire trajectory of your life? I'm curious. Are you watching this from home right now? And have you experienced a moment like that? Please comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. The test results came back positive for Down syndrome. The doctor explained it to me in clinical terms, talking about extra chromosomes and developmental delays and the lifetime of care that my son would require. He spoke with such certainty, such finality, that I felt like he was reading me a death sentence. My son would never be normal. He would never have a typical life. He would always be different, always be a burden, always be a reminder of my mistake. I made my decision that night. While my mother sat in the waiting room with a rosary, while David paced the hallway outside, while nurses checked on my son in the nursery, I told the hospital staff that I wanted to place my baby for adoption. I wanted to sign the papers immediately. I didn't want to hold him again. I didn't want to look at him. I didn't want to feel the weight of him in my arms because I knew that if I did, I wouldn't have the strength to let him go. The social worker who handled my case was a woman named Catherine, probably in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle voice. She tried to talk me out of it. She said that many children with Down syndrome went on to live happy, fulfilling lives. She said that support systems existed now that hadn't existed for previous generations. She said that I should take some time, that I should think about this decision carefully, that I shouldn't make this choice in a moment of despair. But I wasn't listening to her. I was only listening to the voice in my head that kept saying, "Escape, escape, escape." And so, I signed the papers. I signed away my rights as a mother. I signed away the chance to raise my son, to know him, to be part of his life. I did it because I was young and scared and utterly convinced that I was doing the right thing. My mother cried when I told her. She begged me to reconsider. She said that we would figure it out. that our family would help, that she would help me raise my son. But I was angry with her, angry at my father, angry at the world for making me feel like I had no other choice. I told her that I was done discussing it, that my mind was made up, and that she needed to accept it. I left the hospital on November 16th, 1989, 2 days after giving birth. My body was still bleeding, still aching, still recovering from the trauma of labor and delivery. But my son stayed behind. He was placed in foster care while the adoption process moved forward, placed with a family who would hopefully love him the way I couldn't. I went home to my small bedroom in my parents' house, and I tried to pretend that nothing had happened. I went back to work at the library a few weeks later. I hung out with my high school friends. I dated. I went to college. I did all the things that I thought would make me happy, all the things that I thought I was saving myself for, by leaving my son behind. But none of it worked. None of it filled the emptiness that opened up inside me on the day I walked out of that hospital. And I carried that emptiness with me for 35 years. If you've been watching this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to people who need to hear them. And please, tell me in the comments below what you think about Margaret's decision. Do you think she was selfish? Or do you think she was just a frightened young girl? I want to hear your perspective. After I left the hospital, I made a conscious decision to bury what had happened. I told myself that if I didn't think about my son, if I didn't acknowledge his existence, then he wouldn't be real. The pain wouldn't be real. The guilt wouldn't be real. I was 20 years old, and I had just discovered the power of denial, and I clung to it like a drowning person clings to a piece of driftwood. I went back to San Antonio Community College in January of 1990, just 2 months after giving birth. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised everyone around me. I changed my major from art history to business administration because it seemed more practical, more serious, more like the kind of thing a person who had her life together would study. I worked at the library part-time and saved every penny I made. I was building a new life, a better life, a life that had nothing to do with the girl who had been too scared to be a mother. David had gotten engaged to Angela by then. I saw him once at a grocery store in February of 1990, and he looked away from me, pretending he hadn't seen me. His fiancée was with him, and she was pregnant, swollen with a baby that he wanted to have, that he was proud to have. The injustice of it burned inside me, but I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I was happy for him. I told myself that I had made the right choice. My mother stopped asking about my son after a few months. I think she realized that talking about him only made things worse, only reminded me of what I'd done and what I'd lost. My father never mentioned it at all. It was like we'd all agreed, without ever saying it out loud, that this thing had never happened, that my son was a ghost, a phantom, something we would never speak of again. By 1991, I had mostly convinced myself that I was fine. I was dating a man named Robert Chen, who was a business student at the same college. Robert was kind and ambitious, and he wanted to build a life with me. He wanted to get married and have children, and own a house with a white picket fence. He represented everything I thought I wanted, everything I thought would make me happy and normal and whole again. We got married in the summer of 1992 at a small church ceremony. My mother cried happy tears. My father smiled for what felt like the first time in years. Robert's family was thrilled. We were the perfect couple, The kind of people who had their lives figured out, who were on the right track, who had everything to look forward to. I became pregnant with my first biological child in 1993. I was terrified. The pregnancy triggered memories that I'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. Every doctor's appointment, every ultrasound, every moment of nausea and exhaustion brought me back to November of 1989. But I told myself that this was different. This time, I was ready. This time I had a husband, a house, a job, a life that could accommodate a child. This time I could be a good mother. My daughter, Sarah, was born in February of 1994, healthy and perfect, and exactly what Robert and I had dreamed of. I held her in my arms and felt a love so intense that it terrified me. I would have done anything for Sarah. I would have walked through fire for her. And in that moment, holding my beautiful, healthy daughter, I realized the full weight of what I had done. I realized that I had walked away from a child who deserved the exact same love, the exact same devotion, the exact same commitment that I was now pouring into Sarah. The guilt was suffocating. It would hit me at the strangest moments. I would be changing Sarah's diaper, or reading her a bedtime story, or watching her sleep in her crib, and suddenly I would be overwhelmed by the thought of my other son, the one I'd never changed a diaper for, the one I'd never read stories to, the one I'd never watched sleep. I would go into the bathroom and cry, silently so Robert wouldn't hear me. I would splash water on my face and tell myself to get a grip, to stop being so emotional, to focus on the daughter I did have instead of dwelling on the past. Robert was confused by my mood swings. He'd ask me what was wrong, and I would tell him I was just tired, just adjusting to motherhood, just having a bad day. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't admit to him that I had abandoned a child, that I had given away a baby, that I was a woman who had made the most selfish decision of her life and was now being haunted by it. We had a second child, a son, in 1996. I named him Michael, and when I held him for the first time, I thought about the son I'd never held, the son who might have been lying in a hospital nursery somewhere, growing up without a mother. The thought nearly broke me. I loved Michael with a fierce protectiveness that bordered on obsession. I was a devoted mother to both my children, perhaps too devoted, trying to make up for the child I couldn't love, the child I'd abandoned, the child I'd chosen to forget. But the forgetting never truly happened. It was more like a constant low-level ache, something that was always there, something I had learned to live with, the way you learn to live with chronic pain. I would see boys who looked like they might have Down syndrome, and I would wonder if my son looked like that now. I would read articles about adoption and feel my chest tighten. I would pass by the hospital where I'd given birth, and I would have to pull over because I couldn't see through my tears. Robert eventually figured out that something was deeply wrong with me. It was 1998, and we'd been married for 6 years. Sarah was 4, Michael was 2, and I was spiraling. I was drinking more than I should have been. I was taking sleeping pills. I was snapping at Robert and the children over small things, over nothing. I was a woman coming apart at the seams, and I couldn't tell him why. One night, after I'd had too much wine at a dinner party with some of his colleagues, Robert asked me directly. He said, "Margaret, I know something happened to you. Something before me. Something that you've never told me about." He said it gently, but it terrified me. The thought of telling him the truth, of admitting what I'd done, of saying out loud that I had abandoned a child, that I was not the woman he thought I was, that I was capable of such cruelty, such selfishness, such profound moral failure, seemed impossible. So I lied. I told him that I'd had a miscarriage before we met, that I'd gotten pregnant as a teenager and lost the baby, and that the trauma of it had never fully healed. It wasn't completely a lie, I reasoned. I had lost a baby. I just wasn't telling him the full story. I wasn't telling him that I'd chosen to lose that baby. I wasn't telling him that I'd walked away. Robert was compassionate about the miscarriage story. He held me while I cried, and he promised me that he would always be there for me, that we would work through this together, that our beautiful children were proof that we could create good things together. And I felt like a fraud. I felt like a woman pretending to be someone she wasn't, lying in the arms of a man who loved her, all while carrying the secret of what she'd truly done. The late 1990s were a blur of suburban motherhood. We moved to a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood. I got promoted at work. Robert's business was thriving. On the surface, we were living the American dream. We had family photos on the walls. We took vacations to the beach. We hosted holiday parties. We looked like people who had everything figured out, people who had made good choices, people who deserved to be happy. But underneath, I was dying. I was suffocating under the weight of my secret. I was a woman divided into two people, the Margaret who existed in the world, and the Margaret who lived in my head, the one who thought about her abandoned son every single day. In 1999, when Sarah was 5 years old, she asked me if she had any brothers or sisters that she didn't know about. We were in the car driving to her school, and out of nowhere, she just asked it. The question hit me like a physical blow. I nearly swerved into the other lane. My hands started shaking so badly that I had to pull over to the side of the road. Sarah was looking at me with concern, asking if I was okay, and I realized that I wasn't okay. I would never be okay. Not until I faced what I'd done. Not until I told someone the truth. Not until I stopped pretending to be a woman who deserved happiness when I was actually a woman who had abandoned her own child. I told Sarah that she didn't have any other siblings, and then I drove her to school in silence. But that night, after Robert and the children were asleep, I sat in the dark of our living room and made a decision. I was going to find my son. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew that I couldn't keep living like this. The secret was going to destroy me if I didn't do something about it. I started researching adoption records the next day. I learned that Texas had sealed adoption records, that I would need a court order to access them, that the process could take months or even years. I learned that my son, if he was still alive, might not want to meet me, might hate me, might have been told terrible things about me by his adoptive parents. The thought of that rejection, the thought of my son despising me, was almost more than I could bear. I know this story is getting intense, and I want to hear from you. Have you ever kept a secret so big that it started to poison your entire life? Have you ever done something that you couldn't forgive yourself for? Please leave a comment and share your story with our community. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see what happens next. I hired a lawyer in 2000 to help me navigate the adoption system. His name was Frank Morrison, and he was a kind man who specialized in adoption law. When I told him that I wanted to find the child I'd given up for adoption 11 years earlier, he didn't judge me. He simply said, "Okay, let's see what we can do." The process took 2 years. 2 years of waiting, of hoping, of being terrified that the adoption agency wouldn't cooperate, that my son's adoptive parents wouldn't allow contact, that my son wouldn't want anything to do with me. During those 2 years, I couldn't tell Robert. I couldn't tell my parents. I couldn't tell anyone. I was searching for a ghost, reaching out into the darkness, hoping against hope that someone would reach back. In 2002, when my son was 12 years old, Frank called me with news. My son's adoptive parents had agreed to accept a letter from me. They wanted to know more about my medical history. They wanted to understand my circumstances. And most importantly, my son wanted to know if his biological mother was alive, if she was thinking about him, if she had any interest in meeting him. The thought that my son had been asking about me, that he had wanted to know if I was thinking about him, nearly destroyed me. All those years I'd spent trying to forget about him, he had been thinking about me. All those years I'd spent trying to move on, he had been wondering about me. All those years I'd spent pretending he didn't exist, he had been real, growing, living, waiting, hoping. I spent 3 weeks writing that letter. I rewrote it dozens of times. I started with apologies, but they felt empty. I started with explanations, but they felt like excuses. I started with declarations of love, but I was afraid they would feel like lies because I'd never been his mother, never earned the right to love him the way a mother should. In the end, I wrote a simple letter. I told him that I had been young and scared and unprepared to be a mother. I told him that my decision to place him for adoption had nothing to do with him and everything to do with my own failures. I told him that thinking about him had been a constant part of my life, even when I tried to push those thoughts away. I told him that I understood if he didn't want to meet me, that I would respect whatever he decided, but that if he did want to meet me, I would be there. I sealed that letter and sent it off into the world, and then I waited. I waited for 6 months, and I heard nothing. I told myself that he'd decided to ignore me, that my letter hadn't meant anything to him, that he'd chosen to have nothing to do with his biological mother. Part of me was relieved. Part of me was devastated. But in the spring of 2003, Frank called me again. My son wanted to meet me. He was 13 years old, and he wanted to see his biological mother. The adoption agency had agreed to facilitate the meeting, to provide a neutral location where we could meet for the first time. I was 54 years old when I prepared to meet my son for the first time since the day I'd given him away. 54 years old, and I was as terrified as I'd been at 20. More terrified, actually, because now I knew what I'd taken from both of us. Now I knew what 13 years of separation meant. Now I knew that this boy who was coming to meet me had probably been hurt by my absence, probably had questions that I couldn't answer, probably wanted things from me that I didn't know how to give. The night before the meeting, I told Robert the truth. I sat him down in our kitchen after the children were asleep, and I told him everything. I told him about the pregnancy, about the birth, about the decision to place my son for adoption, about the 13 years of secret searching, about the meeting that was going to happen the next day. Robert listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. I was convinced that he was going to leave me, that he was going to tell me that I was a monster, that he couldn't be married to a woman who had abandoned her own child. But instead he took my hand, and he cried with me. He said, "Margaret, I wish you had trusted me with this sooner. I wish you had let me help you carry this burden. But I understand why you didn't. And I'm here now, and we're going to get through this together. I've never loved my husband more than I loved him in that moment. If you're enjoying this story so far, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the incredible moment that's coming next. And please share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. The impact you make by sharing means everything to us. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in April of 2003 at a small office in downtown San Antonio. The adoption agency had set up a private room with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. There was a social worker named Patricia who would facilitate the meeting, making sure that everything went smoothly, that boundaries were respected, that if either of us became too emotional, we could take a break. I arrived 30 minutes early because I was too nervous to sit at home. I sat in my car in the parking lot, trying to breathe, trying to steady my hands, trying to prepare myself for the fact that in 30 minutes I was going to see my son for the first time since November of 1989. 13 years. 13 years of his life that I had missed completely. I kept asking myself, what if he hates me? What if he takes one look at me and decides that I'm exactly what he expected, exactly the kind of woman who could walk away from a baby? What if all the pain he's suffered in his life, all the struggles he's faced because of his Down syndrome, all of it comes down to me, to my failure, to my inability to be his mother? Patricia came out to the waiting room at 2 o'clock and told me that my son had arrived with his adoptive parents. I stood up on shaky legs and followed her down a narrow hallway to the private meeting room. My heart was pounding so hard that I was convinced everyone could hear it. When I walked into that room, the first thing I saw was a boy sitting on a chair, tall for his age, with dark hair and dark eyes, wearing a blue polo shirt and khaki pants. He was looking down at his hands, nervous, picking at his cuticles, doing exactly what I would have done if I were 13 years old and about to meet the woman who had given me up for adoption. Then he looked up, and I saw my face in his face. I saw my father's chin. I saw David's eyes. I saw myself staring back at me, this boy who was half me, half someone else, entirely his own person, and yet somehow unmistakably mine. His name was James. James Michael Patterson. His adoptive parents, Joan and Richard Patterson, stood up when I entered the room. They were a kind-looking couple in their 60s, well-dressed, clearly well-off, clearly the kind of people who could give a child opportunities that I never could have. I couldn't speak. I tried to say something, anything, but no words would come. I just stood there, staring at my son, tears streaming down my face, while Patricia gently guided me to sit down in a chair across from him. James looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He had a round face that was characteristic of Down syndrome, and a small gap between his two front teeth. He was beautiful. My son was beautiful. And I had missed 13 years of his life, 13 years of watching him grow, 13 years of knowing him. Richard put a hand on James's shoulder and said, "James, this is Margaret, your biological mother." And James nodded slowly, like he was trying to understand what that meant, like he was trying to reconcile the image of the woman in his head with the actual woman sitting across from him. I said, "Hello, James." My voice was barely a whisper. "I've been hoping that I would get to meet you someday, and I'm so glad that you wanted to meet me." James didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me. Then he said, in a voice that was slightly slurred but completely clear, "Are you sad?" And I realized that my tears, my obvious distress, had scared him. I laughed, a shaky, broken laugh, and I said, "No, sweetheart, I'm not sad. I'm actually very happy. I'm happy because I get to see you. I've wanted to see you for a very long time." Joan and Richard told me that James had been asking about me since he was very young. They said that they had always been honest with him about his adoption, about the fact that he had a biological mother who had placed him for adoption because she wasn't able to care for him at the time. They said that James understood, in his own way, that this didn't mean I didn't love him. It just meant that I had done what I thought was best for him. I wanted to scream at them. You don't understand. You don't understand what I did. You don't understand that I was selfish and scared, and that I chose my own life over my son's needs. But I didn't say that. Instead, I listened while Joan told me about James's life, about his school, about his friends, about his favorite activities. James loved basketball, apparently. He went to a special school where he was learning job skills so that he could eventually work in the community. He had friends, and he went to birthday parties, and he was learning to read, though his reading level was lower than other children his age. He was a boy with Down syndrome who was living a full life, a life with love and support and opportunities, a life that I could never have given him. And I understood in that moment that my decision to place him for adoption had been the right decision for him. He had thrived with Joan and Richard. He was happy. He was loved. He was secure. All the things that I had convinced myself he would be when I signed those papers 13 years ago had come true. But the relief that came with that understanding was complicated by another realization. If my decision had been right for him, then why did I feel like such a monster? Why did I feel like I had committed some unforgivable sin? Why had I spent 13 years punishing myself for a decision that had actually turned out to be the best thing for my son? Patricia must have sensed my internal struggle because she suggested that James and I take a walk together in the park across the street. Joan and Richard stayed behind in the office while James and I walked along a path lined with oak trees. James walked beside me, not quite touching my hand, but close enough that I could feel his presence. He didn't ask me very many questions. Mostly he talked about himself. He told me about his school, about his basketball team, about a girl named Sophia, who he had a crush on. He was a 13-year-old boy, interested in the things that all 13-year-old boys are interested in, dealing with the normal concerns of adolescence, trying to impress a girl. The only thing that marked him as different from other 13-year-old boys was his slight speech delay, and the way he sometimes lost track of what he was saying midway through a sentence. But even that wasn't so different. I'd known plenty of typically developing teenagers who did the exact same thing. At one point, we sat down on a bench by a small pond, and James turned to me and said, "My mom says that you were very young when you had me." He called Joan his mom, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no resentment. Joan was his mother. She had earned that title by being present, by showing up, by loving him unconditionally. I said yes, I was very young. I was only 18 years old, and I wasn't ready to be a mother. I was scared. James nodded like he understood, and then he said, "Were you scared because I have Down syndrome?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never expected that he would guess the truth, that he would understand on some level that his disability had played a part in my decision to place him for adoption. I wanted to lie to him. I wanted to tell him that his Down syndrome had nothing to do with it, that I would have been scared no matter what. But I couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. He deserved the truth. I said, "Yes, James, I was scared, because of your Down syndrome." I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't know what kind of life you would have. And I was too young and too selfish to try to figure it out. I thought that it would be easier for me to just give you to someone else, someone who knew how to take care of you. I was wrong. James was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My mom says that Down syndrome is just part of who I am. She says that I'm smart in my own ways, and that I can do a lot of things. She says that Down syndrome doesn't make me less of a person, and I realized that Joan had given James something that I never could have given him. She had given him self-acceptance. She had given him the tools to understand his disability, not as a tragedy or a burden, but as part of his identity, something that made him unique but didn't define his entire existence. I reached over and took James's hand, and this time he didn't pull away. He squeezed my hand, and we sat there together in silence, a mother and son separated by 13 years of lost time, trying to figure out how to be connected to each other, despite the distance that I had created. When we went back to the office, Joan and Richard asked if I wanted to exchange contact information. They were willing to facilitate ongoing contact with James, if I wanted it. They weren't threatened by my presence in his life. They seemed to understand that I had given them the greatest gift possible, the gift of their son, and that they could afford to be generous with me because of that. I said yes, immediately, without hesitation. I wanted to see James again. I wanted to get to know him. I wanted to try to be some kind of mother to him, even though I had forfeited that right 13 years ago. Over the next few months, James and I saw each other every other week. We would go to movies or to the park or to get ice cream. We would talk about his life, about school, about his friends, about Sophia, who eventually became his girlfriend. I told him stories about my childhood, about growing up in San Antonio, about the things that I loved. I was trying to build a relationship with him, trying to become someone who mattered in his life, someone who he could trust and count on. Watching this reunion, I have to ask you all something. Do you think that Margaret did the right thing by placing James for adoption, even though it meant missing 13 years of his life? Or do you think she should have fought harder to keep him and raise him herself, no matter what the obstacles were? This question has been eating at me, and I really want to hear your perspective. Leave your honest opinion in the comments below. And if you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe now, because we're getting close to the most emotional moment of this entire story. Robert was supportive of my relationship with James. He encouraged me to spend time with him, to get to know him, to try to repair the damage that I'd done by abandoning him. Sarah and Michael, my biological children, were curious about James. Sarah, who was now 9 years old, understood that James was her half-brother, that he had the same mother that she did. Michael, who was 7, was just excited to have another big brother to play with. But there was a complication that I hadn't anticipated. The more time I spent with James, the more I got to know him, the more I fell in love with him, the more I grieved for the 13 years that I had missed. I was experiencing a kind of delayed motherhood, a kind of after-the-fact bonding that was beautiful, but also tinged with profound loss. And James was starting to ask harder questions. He asked me why I didn't come to see him for so long. He asked me if I had thought about him when he was a little boy. He asked me if I loved him as much as I loved Sarah and Michael. These were the questions that kept me up at night, the questions that made me understand the true cost of my decision. Joan and Richard were navigating their own complicated feelings. They were generous in sharing James with me, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the worry that I might try to take him away from them, that I might fill his head with resentment toward them for raising him, that I might destabilize the life that they had worked so hard to build with him. In October of 2003, 6 months after our first meeting, James came to stay with Robert, Sarah, Michael, and me for a weekend. It was the first time that my biological children got to spend extended time with their half-brother. It was also the first time that I experienced what it might have been like If I had been brave enough to keep him. If I had fought through the fear and the shame and the judgment to raise him as my son. That weekend was magical and heartbreaking in equal measure. James fit into our family seamlessly. He loved playing with Michael. He and Sarah went to a movie together. He and Robert bonded over basketball. He sat at our dinner table and laughed and ate and talked and was just completely, utterly himself. On Sunday morning, as James was getting ready to leave, he hugged me for a long time. He said, "I'm really glad you're my mom." It took me a moment to process what he'd said. I realized that somewhere in the past 6 months, I had stopped being Margaret, the woman who gave him up for adoption, and I had become Mum, a person in his life who he loved and trusted. I held him and cried, and I said, "I'm really glad that you're my son, James. I'm so sorry that it took me so long to figure that out." When Joan picked him up that afternoon, she took me aside and told me something that I will never forget. She said, "Margaret, I want you to know that I'm grateful for what you did. If you hadn't placed James for adoption, he might never have been born. My husband and I couldn't have biological children, and James is our greatest blessing. But I also want you to know that you're his mother too, and there's room in his heart for both of us. Don't be afraid of that." I broke down crying right there in my driveway. Here was the woman who had raised my son, who had every reason to resent me, who could have easily told me to stay away, and instead she was offering me grace. She was telling me that I could be part of James's life, that I didn't have to be relegated to the margins, that motherhood could be shared, could be expanded, could encompass both of us. From 2003 to 2010, I lived in 2 worlds. In one world, I was Margaret Chen, a successful businesswoman with a career, a loving husband, 2 biological children, a nice house in the suburbs. In the other world, I was the woman who had abandoned her son, the mother who had missed 13 years of his life, the person who was trying desperately to make up for lost time. James was my constant reminder of both worlds. Every time I saw him, I was confronted with the evidence of his thriving life with Joan and Richard, which filled me with gratitude and relief. But I was also confronted with the evidence of what I had missed, the 13 years that I could never get back, the early childhood moments that no amount of future connection could restore. The relationship between James and me deepened over those 7 years. He became a teenager, and then a young adult. He grew taller, his voice deepened, his features matured. But his intellectual development remained at a level consistent with his Down syndrome diagnosis. He would always have the cognitive abilities of a younger child, always need supervision and support, always require accommodations in order to function in the world. I learned more about Down syndrome during those years than I could have imagined. I learned that people with Down syndrome had a much longer life expectancy now than they had in 1989, when James was born. I learned that they could learn, could grow, could achieve things that previous generations had been told were impossible. I learned that the greatest obstacle to people with Down syndrome wasn't the disability itself, but the limitations that society imposed on them. And I grieved for all the things that I could have learned if I had been brave enough to stay, if I had been willing to fight against my own fear and selfishness. I grieved for the mother-son relationship that I could have had, the memories that we could have built together, the ordinary moments that make up a life. James graduated from high school in 2007 when he was 17 years old. The graduation was a big event, a celebration of his achievement, a recognition that despite his disability, he had completed an education. Joan and Richard invited me to the ceremony, of course. Robert and Sarah and Michael came with me. We sat together in the gymnasium and watched James walk across the stage to receive his diploma. When James saw me in the audience, he smiled that big, genuine smile that had become so familiar to me. He waved, and everyone around him laughed because his pride was so evident, so unself-conscious. He was proud of himself, and he wanted to make sure that I knew he was proud. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the school cafeteria. Joan and Richard had organized a celebration with cake and punch and decorations. James's friends from school were there, and their families. It was a beautiful representation of the community that had formed around James, the network of people who cared about him and supported him. I pulled James aside during the reception and told him how proud I was of him. I told him that graduating from high school was a huge accomplishment and that he should feel good about what he had achieved. James beamed and he said, "I did it for you, Mom. I wanted to show you that I could do it." The words hit me like a knife. My son had spent years of his life, years of studying and hard work, motivated partly by a desire to show me that he was capable, that he wasn't the burden I had feared he would be. He had spent years trying to prove to me that my fear about his disability had been unfounded. I held him and cried, right there in the middle of the school cafeteria, in front of all those people. I said, "James, you don't ever have to prove anything to me. You are enough. You have always been enough." After high school, James moved into a group home with 2 other young men with intellectual disabilities. Joan and Richard had arranged it carefully, making sure that the home was well staffed, that James would be safe and supported, that he would have the opportunity to develop independence while still having the oversight that he needed. I helped him move into the group home in August of 2007. We decorated his room with posters of basketball players and his favorite movies. We set up his clothes in the closet and his books on the shelf. Joan and Richard were there, of course, and they helped James understand what this transition meant. He was going to live here with his roommates, and his caregivers would help him with cooking and cleaning and managing his money. But he could still see his family any time he wanted. I would pick him up on weekends, and we would go do things together. Joan and Richard would visit him during the week. His life was going to expand, not contract. He was going to have more independence, more freedom, more opportunity to become his own person. The first time I picked James up from the group home for a weekend visit, I felt a strange reversal of roles. When I'd left him at the hospital in 1989, I had been the one doing the leaving, abandoning him in his most vulnerable moment. Now, decades later, I was the one picking him up, the one showing up, the one proving through my presence and my consistent showing up that he mattered to me. James worked at a coffee shop in San Antonio as a busboy. He made minimum wage, and he was proud of his job. He took the bus to work most days, with support from one of his caregivers. He was building a life, slowly and carefully, with all the proper supports in place. I would sometimes go to the coffee shop and watch him work. He was friendly with the customers, efficient in clearing tables, happy to have a job. I would sit at one of the tables and feel this overwhelming sense of gratitude that he had survived, that he had thrived, that despite my abandonment, he had become a person who could contribute to society, who could care for himself with support, who had purpose and meaning in his life. But I was also aware, in a way that I hadn't been before, of how much harder his life was than it needed to be. When I watched James navigate the world, I saw the barriers that society placed in front of him. I saw how people looked at him, the way their eyes would register his disability, the way some people would talk to him slowly or loudly, as if his Down syndrome affected his hearing or his understanding of normal speech. I began to volunteer with an organization that advocated for people with intellectual disabilities. I did it partly as a form of penance. I felt like I owed something to James, like I needed to give back to the community that had supported him, like I needed to use my privilege and my platform to help other families navigate the world with a child with a disability. But I also did it because I was angry. I was angry at my younger self for believing all the lies that society had told me about Down syndrome, about disability, about the supposed tragedy of raising a child with special needs. I was angry at the doctors who had presented Down syndrome as a death sentence, who hadn't told me about the incredible potential that James would have, who hadn't given me access to the support systems that might have made it possible for me to raise him. I was angry at my parents for not fighting harder to keep James in the family. I was angry at David for moving on so quickly and easily. I was angry at myself most of all, for being so young and so scared and so selfish that I had thrown away the chance to be James's mother. In 2008, Robert and I attended a parent support group for families of children with intellectual disabilities. I attended partly for support, but also because I wanted to meet other parents who had faced the decision that I had faced, who had either chosen adoption or had fought to raise their children themselves. There was a woman named Lisa in the group who had a daughter with Down syndrome. Lisa's daughter was 19 years old, and she was living at home with Lisa and her husband. They had decided, after the initial shock and fear of the diagnosis, that they were going to raise their daughter, that they were going to fight through the difficulties and the judgment and the financial hardship in order to be present in their daughter's life. Lisa told the group that there had been moments when she regretted that decision. There had been nights when she'd cried because she was exhausted, because she hadn't had a full night's sleep in 18 years, because she felt like her life had been consumed by her daughter's needs. But she also said that she wouldn't change anything, that her daughter had taught her more about love and acceptance and unconditional grace than anyone else in her life could have. I listened to Lisa's story, and I felt something break open inside me. I raised my hand and told the group my story. I told them about James, about my decision to place him for adoption, about the 13 years of separation, about the reunion and the slow rebuilding of our relationship. The group was supportive and non-judgmental. They told me that they understood why I had made the decision I had made, that they weren't surprised that I had felt scared and unprepared. But they also helped me understand something important. My decision to place James for adoption had been made from a place of fear and limited information. My decision had been made in a time when society was far less supportive of people with disabilities than it was now. If I had made that same decision in 2008, knowing what I now knew, having access to the support systems that now existed, I would have made a different choice. The past couldn't be changed, but the present and the future could be. And what I needed to focus on now was being present for James, on making amends for the lost time, on using my experience to help other families make more informed decisions. In 2009, when James was 19 years old, he asked me if I would help him fill out an application to a program that would help him learn independent living skills. The program would teach him how to cook simple meals, how to manage his money, how to take care of his personal hygiene, how to navigate public transportation more independently. I helped him fill out the application, and he was accepted into the program. As I watched him work through the curriculum, learning these basic life skills that so many people take for granted, I was struck by how much potential he had, how much he was capable of learning and growing, how much harm had been avoided by placing him with Joan and Richard, who had given him every opportunity to develop his abilities. But I was also struck by what I had missed. I had missed being there when he took his first steps, when he said his first word, when he started school, when he learned to read, when he hit all the milestones that children hit on their way to becoming adults, and no amount of present connection could give that back to me. One evening in 2010, James and I were sitting on the porch of the group home, watching the sun set. He said to me, "Mom, do you ever wish that you had kept me?" It was a question that I had been asking myself for years, but I had never expected him to ask it directly. I took a moment to think about how to answer honestly. I said, "James, I think the answer to that question is complicated. When I was young, I didn't know how to be your mother. I was scared and unprepared, and I made a choice that I thought was best for you. And in many ways, that choice turned out to be the right one, because Joan and Richard have given you so much love and support and opportunity. But do I wish that I had been brave enough to stay, to fight through the fear, to be present in your life from the beginning? Yes, sometimes I do. I wish that I had trusted myself more. I wish that I had had more faith in my own capacity to love and care for you. I wish that I hadn't let fear make my decisions for me. But I also know that wishing for a different past doesn't change the present. What I can do now is be here for you. I can love you. I can be proud of you. I can support you. I can try to be the mother that I should have been from the beginning." James nodded, and he put his hand on my hand. He said, "I love you, Mom, and I'm glad that you're part of my life now, even if you weren't at the beginning." If this story has touched your heart, I'm asking you to please take a moment right now to like this video, to subscribe to the channel, and to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you have your own story of abandonment or regret that you've been carrying. Maybe you know someone who's dealing with similar guilt and shame. By sharing this video, you're helping us reach people who need to know that redemption is possible, that forgiveness exists, even when we feel like we don't deserve it. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Now let's see what happens next in Margaret's story. By 2010, I had become comfortable with the paradox of my life. I was a woman who had made a terrible choice, but that choice had led to a good outcome. I was a woman who had abandoned her son, but who had been given the extraordinary gift of reconnection. I was a woman who had lived in shame for so many years, but who had finally found a way to move forward, not by erasing what I had done, but by accepting it and trying to make amends. James had become a central part of my life again, not in the way that he would have been if I had raised him from birth, but in a way that was authentic and real and meaningful. He knew that I loved him. He knew that I was proud of him. He knew that I regretted my decision, but that I was grateful for the opportunity to know him now. And Sarah and Michael, my biological children, had grown up with a relationship with their half-brother that was warm and loving and uncomplicated. They didn't judge me for having placed James for adoption. They were simply grateful that they got to have him in their lives, that they had a brother who they could love and support. Robert had been my greatest blessing through all of this. He had stood by me, had supported my relationship with James, had helped me navigate the complicated emotions that came with reunion and reconciliation. Our marriage had been tested, but it had ultimately been strengthened by the process of me finally being honest about who I was and what I had done. In 2010, I was 59 years old. I had lived more than 40 years since abandoning James, and I had spent the last 7 years trying to rebuild our relationship. I still had regrets, still had moments when I thought about the life I could have had with him, if I had been braver, if I had been stronger, if I had been willing to fight through the fear. But I was also at peace with myself in a way that I hadn't been since I was 18 years old. I had stopped running from my past. I had stopped pretending that I was someone I wasn't. I had owned my mistakes, and I was trying to make them right, one day at a time, one moment at a time. The decade from 2010 to 2020 was, in many ways, the decade in which I finally became the mother to James that I should have been all along. It wasn't the kind of motherhood that comes from raising a child from infancy, from being present for all the milestones and the ordinary moments. But it was a motherhood that was built on intention, on showing up, on choosing to be present even though I had no obligation to be. James continued to live in the group home, but he became more independent over time. He kept his job at the coffee shop, and eventually he was promoted to a position where he did more than just bussing tables. He helped with inventory. He learned to operate the cash register with support. He became a valued member of the team. His boss told Joan and Richard that James was one of the most reliable workers in the shop, that he showed up on time and worked hard, and treated customers with genuine kindness. I was at the coffee shop one day in 2011, about a year after James had been promoted, and I watched him interact with a customer. An elderly man came in, looked confused about the menu, and James went over to him and patiently explained all the options. The man ordered a coffee, and James made sure to remember exactly how the man wanted it prepared. When the man came back a week later, James remembered his order without being told. That's when I truly understood that James had the capacity for meaningful work, for genuine contribution to society, for the kind of dignity that comes from having a job and doing it well. All the fears that I had harbored about his disability, all the catastrophic thoughts about what his life would be like, they had been based on nothing. James's life was good. He was living a good life. In 2012, James met a girl named Sophie at a community recreation program. Sophie also had Down syndrome, and she also lived in a group home. They bonded over their shared love of basketball and their mutual awkwardness around dating. I watched my son experience the first stirrings of romantic love, and I felt something that I had never felt before. I felt the normal, ordinary anxiety of a mother watching her son navigate relationships. James would ask me for advice about Sophie. He would tell me that he wanted to hold her hand, that he wanted to ask her to be his girlfriend. I would give him advice, would help him practice what he was going to say, would encourage him to be honest about his feelings. This was parenting, I realized. This was what I had missed. Not just the big moments, but these small, everyday conversations about life and love and relationships. James and Sophie started dating in 2012, and they were together for 3 years. They would go to movies together, go to the park, hold hands while they walked down the street. It was sweet and innocent and beautiful to watch. When they eventually broke up, it was because Sophie's family moved to a different part of Texas, and long distance wasn't feasible for them. James was heartbroken, and I held him while he cried, and I told him that what he had experienced with Sophie was real and meaningful, and that it was okay to grieve the loss of a relationship. In 2014, when James was 24 years old, Joan and Richard had a health scare. Richard had a heart attack, and he spent 2 weeks in the hospital. It was a wake-up call for all of us. Richard survived, but it made everyone acutely aware of the fact that Joan and Richard, who were now in their 70s, wouldn't be able to care for James forever. I remember sitting with Richard in his hospital room, and he said to me, "Margaret, if something happens to me and Joan, I need to know that James is going to be taken care of. I need to know that he's going to be okay." And I promised him, without hesitation, that James would be okay. I promised him that I would be involved in every major decision about James's care, that I would make sure he had the support he needed, that I would be present for him for the rest of his life. It was a promise that I meant with every fiber of my being. I was no longer the young, scared woman who had abandoned her son because she was afraid of what having a child with Down syndrome would mean. I was a woman who had come to understand the depth of my son's worth, who had come to love him unconditionally, who was willing to make sacrifices for his well-being. After Richard's heart attack, the family had conversations about the future. Joan and Richard wanted to make sure that James's care was well planned, that his group home was stable, that his finances were managed properly. They wanted to establish a trust that would ensure James would have funds for care and support, even after Joan and Richard were gone. I got involved in those conversations. I consulted with an elder law attorney. I helped Joan and Richard understand their options for guardianship and financial planning. I made sure that my involvement in James's life was formalized, that there were legal documents that would allow me to make decisions about his care if something happened to Joan and Richard. This was a profound shift for me. I was no longer just a woman trying to make amends for past abandonment. I was a woman who was willing to take on legal and financial responsibility for my son's well-being. I was a woman who was planning for his future, who was thinking about what would happen to him after I was gone, who was committed to his care for the duration of both our lives. Robert supported all of this, of course. He had always been supportive of my relationship with James, but now he became actively involved in the planning process. He helped me understand the financial implications of James's care. He encouraged me to have difficult conversations with Joan and Richard about what would happen as they aged. He was my partner in making sure that James would be cared for. In 2015, I retired from my job in business administration. I was 64 years old, and I had worked for 40 years, and I felt like I had earned the right to step back from my career. Robert was still working, but we had savings. We had Social Security coming. We had a comfortable life. With retirement came more time to spend with James. I started picking him up from the group home every Saturday, and we would spend the day together. We would go to movies, to restaurants, to the park. We would visit Joan and Richard. We would just sit and talk about his life, his job, his friends, his feelings. During this time, I also started writing down our stories. I wrote about the pregnancy, about the abandonment, about the reunion, about the years of rebuilding our relationship. I wrote about the feelings of guilt and shame that I had carried, and about the gradual shift toward acceptance and forgiveness. I wasn't writing for anyone else at first. I was writing for me, as a way of processing my emotions, as a way of making sense of the life I had lived. But eventually I started thinking about the possibility of sharing these stories. I started to wonder if there were other parents out there who had made the decision I had made, who were carrying the same guilt and shame, who might benefit from hearing that redemption was possible. In 2017, Joan suffered a stroke. She recovered, but it was a significant health event, and it made clear that she and Richard were aging, that their time was limited. Joan's stroke also had cognitive effects. She sometimes forgot things, sometimes got confused. The woman who had raised James so beautifully, so carefully, so full of love, was slowly fading. I started spending more time at Joan and Richard's house, helping them with James, helping them with household tasks, being there as a support system as they aged. I would sit with Joan, and she would tell me stories about James, about raising him, about the joy he had brought into her life, and I would think about how close I had come to not having any of this, to having missed out on knowing this incredible woman who had been the true mother to my son. One afternoon in 2017, Joan took my hand and said to me, "Margaret, I've always been grateful that you gave us James, but I want you to know that I'm also grateful that you came back into his life. James is more confident, more secure, more happy because he knows that you love him. That's a gift, Margaret. That's something that you gave to our family." I cried right there in Joan's living room because her words represented a kind of forgiveness that I hadn't expected. She had every reason to resent me, to see me as a threat, to want to protect her relationship with James as the only motherly relationship he had. Instead, she had extended grace to me. She had welcomed me into James's life. She had shown me that there was room in James's heart for both of us. In 2018, Richard passed away. He was 81 years old, and he had lived a full life, a good life, and he had left an incredible legacy in his son, James. I was at the funeral, and I sat in the front row next to Joan, and I grieved for a man who had been a father to my son in every way that mattered. After Richard's death, Joan's health declined more rapidly. She was dealing with the grief of losing her husband, and the physical toll of aging, and the cognitive effects of her stroke. She went into a nursing home in 2019, and James moved into a new group home that was closer to the nursing home so he could visit her regularly. I visited Joan regularly in the nursing home. I would bring her flowers or books or her favorite snacks. I would sit with her and hold her hand, and sometimes she would know who I was, and sometimes she wouldn't. On the days when she didn't remember me, I would introduce myself and remind her about James, and usually that would spark something in her memory. One day in 2019, Joan took my hand and said, "You're the one who brought my James, aren't you? You're the one who gave me my son." I said, "Yes, Joan. I'm the one who placed James for adoption, and you took care of him. You loved him. You were the mother that he needed." Joan squeezed my hand and said, "And you're his mother too. Don't ever forget that. You gave him life. That matters." Joan passed away in January of 2020. She was 83 years old. I was at her funeral, and I gave a eulogy in which I talked about what an incredible mother she had been to James, what an incredible woman she had been, how grateful I was for everything she had done. After the funeral, I became James's primary contact person for all major decisions. With Richard gone and Joan gone, James's care fell to me, and to the professional team that managed his group home. But the emotional responsibility, the sense that I was his mother, that I needed to be present for him, that he depended on me, was entirely on me now. I know this story is getting heavier, and if you're still watching, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. These moments in James's life, losing Joan and Richard, this was when Margaret really stepped up and became the mother she should have been all along. But before we continue to the final part of this story, I need you to do something for me. Please like this video, please subscribe to the channel, and please, in the comments below, tell me what you think about Joan's forgiveness. How does it make you feel to know that the woman who raised James was so gracious about sharing him with Margaret? Let me know your thoughts. In 2020, with Joan and Richard both gone, I had to think carefully about what James needed from me, and what I needed to do to be there for him in this new phase of his life. He was still living in his group home, still working at the coffee shop, still maintaining the routines that gave his life structure and meaning. But he was also dealing with grief, with the loss of the two people who had raised him, with the reality that his life was going to change. I spent even more time with him during 2020. The pandemic had shut down many of the activities that James enjoyed, but we found ways to stay connected. We would go for drives. We would sit in parks. We would talk on the phone almost every day. I was trying to be the steady, constant presence that he needed, the mother who would be there for him, who wouldn't abandon him again, who would show up, no matter what. During the pandemic, I also had more time to think about my life, to reflect on the journey I had taken from that young, scared 18-year-old girl who had left her son at the hospital, to the woman I was now, at 69 years old, who was fully engaged in her son's life. I thought about the what-ifs. What if I had been brave enough to keep James? What if I had trusted myself? What if I had asked for help instead of running away? But I also thought about the reality of what had actually happened. James had been raised by two people who loved him deeply. He had been given opportunities and support that I might not have been able to provide. He had thrived in ways that seemed impossible back in 1989, when the doctors told me he had Down syndrome. And now, in this final chapter of our lives, we had been given the gift of reunion. We had been given the opportunity to know each other, to love each other, to build a relationship that was real and meaningful and lasting. That was something to be grateful for. That was something that redeemed all the years of guilt and shame and regret. In the summer of 2021, I made a decision that terrified me and liberated me at the same time. I decided to tell James the full truth about why I had placed him for adoption. Not the sanitized version that I had given him over the years. Not the explanation that he was too young to fully understand. But the complete, brutal, honest truth about my fear, my selfishness, my inability to see past my own limitations. I had been carrying this secret for so long, this core fear that if James really understood how selfish I had been, if he truly grasped the depth of my cowardice, he would stop loving me. But I had come to understand that keeping secrets was a form of dishonesty, a way of preventing real intimacy, a way of protecting myself instead of truly honoring my relationship with my son. So, on a Saturday afternoon in June of 2021, I picked James up from his group home, and instead of going to our usual movie or restaurant, I drove him to a quiet park overlooking the San Antonio River. We sat on a bench, and I told him that I needed to talk to him about something important, something about my decision to place him for adoption. James looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He said, "Mom, what do you want to tell me?" And I took a deep breath, and I told him everything. I told him that when I found out I was pregnant with him, I was terrified. I told him that when I found out he had Down syndrome, my terror became panic. I told him that I didn't think I could handle it, that I didn't believe I was capable of being his mother, that I was convinced that he would have a better life without me. I told him that I was wrong. I told him that my fear had made me do something that I had regretted for every single day of the last 32 years. I told him that if I could go back and do it again, knowing what I know now, I would never have left him at that hospital. I would have fought through the fear. I would have asked for help. I would have stayed. I cried as I told him all of this. I didn't try to hide my tears or my emotion. I wanted him to see how much this mattered to me, how much he mattered to me, how much pain my decision had caused me. James was quiet for a long time after I finished speaking. He didn't say anything. He just looked out at the river, watching the water flow past, and I was terrified that I had made a terrible mistake, that I had told him too much, that I had damaged our relationship beyond repair. Finally, James turned to me and said, "Mom, I understand that you were scared." Mom Joan and Dad Richard told me that being a parent is scary sometimes. They told me that it's okay to be scared, as long as you don't let the scared make you do bad things. They said you did a bad thing because you were scared, but they also said that you came back, and you loved me, and that's what matters. His words, the simple wisdom of them, the kindness of them, nearly destroyed me. My son, the one I had abandoned, the one I had every reason to resent me, was offering me forgiveness that I didn't deserve. He was seeing past my cowardice to the love that I had for him, the love that had brought me back, the love that had made me fight to be part of his life. I pulled James close to me, and we sat there together on that bench overlooking the river, and I felt something shift inside me. The weight that I had been carrying for 32 years, the constant burden of guilt and shame and regret, it didn't disappear completely, but it became lighter. It became something that I could carry without it crushing me completely. James said, "Mom, I'm glad that you're my mom. I'm glad that you came back." And I said, "James, I'm so glad that you're my son. I'm so sorry. It took me so long to figure that out." We sat there in silence for a while, just being together, just existing in this space that we had carved out for ourselves, this relationship that had been rebuilt from the ashes of abandonment and loss. Over the next few months, I did something that I had been thinking about for years. I started writing down my story in detail, not just the facts and the timeline, but the emotions, the internal struggle, the journey from guilt to forgiveness. I wrote about the shame that I had carried, the ways that I had tried to hide from what I had done, the slow process of facing myself and accepting my past. I didn't know what I was going to do with these writings. I just knew that I needed to put them somewhere, to make them real, to transform them from the constant internal monologue of guilt that had plagued me for so long into something external, something that could perhaps help other people. In September of 2021, I shared my story with a counselor who specialized in adoption issues. Her name was Dr. Patricia Alvarez, and she had worked with families dealing with the aftermath of adoption for 30 years. I thought she would judge me, would tell me that I had made a terrible mistake, would confirm all the negative things I had thought about myself for 3 decades. Instead, she told me something that changed the way I understood my entire life. She said, "Margaret, you made a decision from a place of fear and limited information. That decision wasn't good, and it caused harm. But you've spent the last 30 years trying to make amends for that decision. You've built a real relationship with James. You've supported him, loved him, and been present for him. What you've done is not redemption in the sense of erasing what you did, but redemption in the sense of choosing, over and over again, to be the person that your son deserved." She suggested that I consider sharing my story publicly, that there might be other parents who had made similar decisions, who were carrying similar guilt, who might benefit from hearing that a path forward existed. The thought of sharing my story publicly terrified me. I had spent 32 years hiding this secret, keeping it carefully compartmentalized, only revealing it to the people closest to me. The idea of putting my failure, my shame, my deepest regrets out into the world seemed impossible. But I also thought about James, and about how my story might help other people. I thought about the young girl who was pregnant with a child with Down syndrome right now, who was scared just like I had been, who might think that abandonment was her only option. I thought about the parents who had made the same decision I had made, who were carrying the same guilt, who might need to hear that forgiveness was possible. So in early 2022, I reached out to a local journalist about telling my story. Her name was Rebecca Santos, and she worked for a regional newspaper in Texas. When I told her my story, she was moved, and she asked if she could do a feature article about my life, about my decision to place James for adoption, about the reunion and the relationship we had built. The article came out in the spring of 2022. It was the first time that I had publicly acknowledged my abandonment of James, the first time that I had allowed my shame to be seen by strangers. I was terrified when the article was published. I was convinced that people would judge me, would call me a monster, would tell me that I didn't deserve forgiveness. Instead, something unexpected happened. The article went viral. People shared it on social media. Messages started pouring in from other parents who had placed children for adoption, from people with Down syndrome, from families dealing with disability. Many of them thanked me for my honesty, told me that my story had helped them understand their own experiences, told me that they had felt less alone after reading about my journey. One message came from a woman named Elena, who had placed her daughter for adoption 30 years ago when she found out the child had cerebral palsy. Elena had spent 3 decades carrying the same guilt and shame that I had carried. After reading my story, she decided to try to find her daughter. She reached out to the adoption agency, and within a year, she had made contact with her adult daughter. Another message came from a man named David, who had been my ex-boyfriend, the father of James. David was now 72 years old, retired, and he had read the article. He reached out to me, and he said that he had always wondered what happened to the baby, that he had thought about me and the child over the years, that he was grateful to know that the child had been raised with love and support. David asked if he could meet James. At first, I was hesitant. James already had his biological father, David Chen, and I didn't want to complicate his sense of identity or family. But James, when I asked him, was curious. He wanted to meet David, to understand his genetic history, to know where half of his DNA came from. So in the summer of 2022, more than 30 years after I had last seen David, we met again. He came to San Antonio, and the 3 of us, James, David, and I, sat down together. David looked older, of course, but he was still recognizable as the young man I had known in 1989. He was gentle with James, curious about him, clearly moved by meeting his biological son. David told James about his life, about his work, about his own children and grandchildren. He told James that he was proud of him, that he was glad that James had been raised with so much love and support, that he regretted not being able to be part of James's life from the beginning. James, in his straightforward way, accepted David's presence without complications. David was another person who loved him, another person who cared about him, another connection to his biological history. James was capable of holding space for multiple relationships, multiple forms of family, multiple sources of love. As I watched David and James interact, I felt something close to peace. This man had loved me once, and I had rejected him and his offer of marriage and his willingness to be a father to our child. For 30 years, I had carried some residual guilt about how I had treated him. But now, seeing him meet James, seeing them smile at each other, I understood that everything had worked out the way it needed to work out. If I had married David, we probably would have been miserable. We were too young, too unprepared, too damaged by circumstance and fear. If I had raised James myself, without Joan and Richard, without their resources and their experience and their unconditional love, James probably would have struggled more, would have had fewer opportunities, would have lived a smaller life. The decisions that I had made in 1989, motivated by fear and selfishness, had somehow led to an outcome that was ultimately good for everyone involved. Not because my fear and selfishness were justified, but because the universe had a way of working things out, of turning pain into purpose, of transforming abandonment into an opportunity for eventual reunion and redemption. In late 2022, I was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. The diagnosis brought everything into sharp focus. I was 71 years old. I had maybe 10 to 15 years left if I was lucky. I had spent the first 60 years of my life running from my past, hiding my shame, living as a divided woman. I had spent the last 20 years trying to make amends, trying to rebuild, trying to become whole. The cancer diagnosis made me realize that I needed to formalize my relationship with James in a new way. I hired an attorney and officially designated myself as James's legal guardian. I set up a trust fund to ensure that James would be financially supported for the rest of his life. I wrote a detailed care plan that outlined James's preferences, his routines, his needs, his dreams, and most importantly, I wrote a letter to James that he would receive after I died. In that letter, I told him about my love for him, about my regret for the years I had missed, about my pride in the man he had become. I told him that I was sorry for abandoning him, and that I was grateful that he had forgiven me. I told him that he should continue to live his life with joy, with purpose, with the knowledge that he was loved. Fortunately, my cancer diagnosis came with good news. The cancer was caught early, the prognosis was excellent, and after surgery and a round of radiation, I was declared cancer-free. At 71 years old, I had been given a second chance at life, a reprieve from the mortality that I had suddenly become aware of. That reprieve, that second chance, made me recommit to being fully present in my remaining years. I reduced my volunteering work slightly, but I increased the time I spent with James. I spent more time with Robert, who was now 79 years old, and had his own health challenges. I spent more time with Sarah and Michael, my biological children, who had grown into accomplished adults. In the spring of 2023, when James was 33 years old, he achieved something that nobody would have predicted back in 1989, when the doctors told me he had Down syndrome. James was hired to work at the library in San Antonio, the same library where I had worked as a file clerk when I was 18 years old, the same library where I had discovered I was pregnant. It seemed almost too poetic to be true. My son, the one I had been told would be a burden, who I had been afraid would destroy my life, was working in the same place where my life had spiraled out of control. And he was doing good work, was being valued by his employers, was making a real contribution to the community. On James's first day at the library, I went to see him at work. He was shelving books in the history section, and he was so proud to show me what he was doing. He said, "Mom, I'm helping people find books. I'm making the library better." I watched my son work, and I thought about the girl I had been at 18, standing on a stepladder in this same building, feeling the first waves of nausea that signaled the beginning of a pregnancy that would change my life forever. I thought about the fear that I had felt, the desperation, the conviction that my life was over. But my life hadn't been over. It had been transformed. It had been complicated and painful and guilt-ridden, but it had also been redeemed. Through James, through the process of knowing him, through the slow work of making amends, I had become a better person. I had become the person that I should have been all along. In the summer of 2023, I received a letter from the governor of Texas. Apparently, my story, which had been shared thousands of times on social media, had caught the attention of the office of the governor. The letter commended me for my advocacy work on behalf of people with intellectual disabilities, for my willingness to be vulnerable and honest about my mistakes, for my efforts to help other families navigate the complex terrain of adoption and disability. The governor's office invited me to speak at a disability awareness conference in Austin. I was terrified, but James encouraged me. He said, "Mom, you should tell your story. People need to hear it. I need people to understand that Down syndrome doesn't make someone less worthy of love." So in September of 2023, I stood on a stage in front of 300 people, many of whom had intellectual disabilities, many of whom were parents of children with disabilities, many of whom were professionals in the field of developmental services. And I told my story. I told them about the pregnancy, the abandonment, the reunion, the long process of rebuilding. And I told them something else. I told them that if I could go back and do it again, knowing what I know now, I would never place James for adoption. I would have fought through the fear. I would have asked for help. I would have trusted myself to be his mother. Because what I have learned over the last 34 years is that James was never the problem. James was never a burden. James was a gift, and I was too young and too scared to understand that at the time. But I also told them that I understood why some parents made the decision to place their children for adoption. I understood the fear, the sense of being overwhelmed, the belief that someone else could do a better job. And I told them that if they had made that decision, if they were carrying guilt about it the way I had carried guilt, there was a path forward. There was redemption. There was the possibility of reunion, of rebuilding, of finding peace. When I finished speaking, the entire room stood up and applauded. I saw people crying, saw parents nodding, saw people with Down syndrome looking at me with expressions of understanding and recognition. I had told my truth, and it had mattered. My shame, my failure, my journey from desperation to redemption, it had meaning. After the speech, a young woman with Down syndrome named Maria came up to me. She was about 20 years old, and she had heard my story. She said to me, "I'm glad your son has a mom who loves him. I'm glad you came back." And I cried again, because this young woman, who had no stake in my story, no reason to care about my journey, had seen the most important thing. She had seen that love mattered, that showing up mattered, that even late reconciliation was better than permanent estrangement. Now, at 72 years old, I sit with James on Saturday afternoons, and we talk about his life, his job, his dreams. He wants to save up money to take a vacation to the beach. He wants to maybe adopt a dog someday. He wants to continue working at the library. These are small dreams, ordinary dreams, the kind of dreams that any young adult might have. But to me, they are extraordinary. They are the dreams of a man who has thrived despite being abandoned, who has built a good life despite starting out with a mother who was too scared to keep him, who has learned to love and trust despite the ultimate betrayal. I was never the mother that James needed in 1989. I wasn't brave enough, wasn't prepared enough, wasn't whole enough. But over the last 20 years, I have tried to become the mother he deserved. I have shown up. I have loved him. I have fought for his rights and his dignity and his inclusion in the world. Is it enough? Can 20 years of presence make up for 30 years of absence? I don't know. But what I do know is that it's real. What James and I have built together is real. The love is real. The forgiveness is real. The redemption is real. I think about the girl I was at 18, standing at a crossroads, choosing the path of fear instead of the path of love. I think about how different my life could have been if I had made a different choice. I think about the pain that could have been avoided, the lost years, the decades of shame. But I also think about the journey that has brought me here, to this moment, at 72 years old, sitting with my son who loves me, who has forgiven me, who has shown me that grace exists, even when we feel like we don't deserve it. My name is Margaret Elena Rodriguez Chen, and I am the woman who abandoned her son. But I am also the woman who came back. I am the woman who chose, over and over again, to fight through her fear, and her shame, and her guilt, in order to be present. I am the woman who was given the extraordinary gift of reunion with the child I had given up. And to anyone watching this who has made a choice that you regret, who is carrying shame that you feel like you will never be able to set down, who has abandoned something or someone and thought that redemption was impossible, I want to tell you something. Redemption is possible. It's not easy. It doesn't erase what you've done, but it's possible. You can go back. You can face what you've done. You can ask for forgiveness, and if you're very lucky, very blessed, the people you've hurt will forgive you, and you will have the opportunity to rebuild, to show up, to become the person you should have been all along. That's what I did, and if I could do it, anyone can. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story about Margaret's journey from abandonment to redemption. If this story has touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you have a similar story of regret or reconciliation. Maybe you know someone who's dealing with guilt about adoption or disability. By sharing this story, you're helping us reach the people who need it most. And please, come back to watch more stories like this one. These are the stories that matter. These are the stories that change lives. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.